As Susan mentioned, I'm now a visiting fellow at Brown University at the Watson Institute for International Studies, and I can report from the campus that it's a great new generation coming along. Great new generation. They're very open-minded, and they care about what's happening beyond our borders. In fact, international relations, the concentration, the major at Brown, for the first time became #1. IR became #1 among students, passing, I think, biology. And I think that bodes well for our country, this new generation that really wants to know different languages, different cultures, what's happening around the world. So I think that bodes well for our country. I thought what I'd do is run through chronologically my time in the Senate, and then take some questions and answers. And as Susan said, when my dad was a senator, I was mayor of my city, and he announced that he wasn't going to run for another term in 2000. And so I stepped up to the plate and said, I'll run for it. I'd been mayor of my city for 7 years, and started raising money when he died in office, and the Republican governor appointed me in late 1999, November of 1999. So all of a sudden I went from being a mayor of my city and dealing with firefighters and street sweeping and snow plowing and all the local issues to being a senator. And of course, with my dad being senator and being someone that always follows the news, I knew how partisan it was. But when I got there, I was really surprised. There was even more partisan than I expected. And I compared it to trench warfare, World War I trench warfare. And President Clinton was the Democratic president. The Republicans controlled the House and Senate. And it was like the Republicans in one trench and the Democrats in another. We had our machine guns and shoot across no man's land at each other, and nothing would get done. For instance, on the issues back then, minimum wage, something called the Patient's Bill of Rights, the estate tax, these are the big issues. And what would happen is the Republicans would pass a bill that President Clinton would promise to veto. We would go ahead and pass it anyway. The president would exercise his threat and veto it. The Republicans wouldn't have the votes to override, and we'd get nothing done and go on to the next issue. Minimum wage, state tax, whatever the issues were back then. And so I said to my leader, Trent Lott, why don't we work with the Democratic president? And maybe the minimum wage won't be as low as Republicans want. It might not be as high as President Clinton wants, but at least we'll make some progress on issues such as minimum wage. And Trent said, oh no, we're getting ready for the 2000 elections. We're going to increase our numbers. These issues work for us politically. I said, okay, well, you've been here longer than I have. Let's see how it works. But what happened in the 2000 elections is Republicans got wiped out, if you remember. All across the country, Republican incumbents lost. Slade Gordon in Washington, longtime incumbent from the state of Washington, Republican, lost. Rod Grams in Minnesota lost. Bill Roth IRAs, the chairman of the Finance Committee, powerful senator from Delaware, he lost. Spencer Abraham in Michigan lost. When incumbents lose, that's significant. Incumbents bring great advantage, and statistically, of course, that's proven. We bring back federal money, we're on TV, all the advantages that come with incumbency. But this time in 2000, so many Republicans were losing. John Ashcroft lost in Missouri in 2002. The dead man, yes. Mel Carnahan was the governor of Missouri, and he was on the ballot after perishing in a plane crash, still on the ballot. So the voters of Missouri went in and voted for the deceased Mel Carnahan and ousted a longtime politician, John Ashcroft. He'd been Attorney General, he'd been governor, and then U.S. Senator. Out he went. So the message was the opposite of what my leader, Trent Lott, was expecting. The Americans were all across the country were saying, we're tired of this partisanship. We're tired of it. We want you to work together and get things done. After the impeachment and the shutdown of the government, all that, they were saying, we're tired of it. At the same time, who were they electing as the next president? Yes, barely, but nonetheless with enough electoral votes. The uniter, not the divider. George W. Bush, who at every campaign stop, as a supporter and a contributor to him as governor of Texas, I like that message. I'm a uniter, not a divider. I worked with the Democrats in Texas. I'll bring a new air to Washington. And I remember him very, very clearly also saying in the debates when Jim Lehrer asked a pretty fair question to ask the candidates for President of the United States, what kind of foreign policy will you have? I remember it clear as day in the fall of 2000 in the debates against Al Gore. And what did Governor George W. Bush say? we'll have a humble foreign policy. If we're arrogant, the world will resent us. And I was cheering, watching on my TV, cheering. That's my candidate. That's exactly the message I wanted to hear. I want a humble foreign policy. I wanted a unifying agenda coming out of Washington. So when the Supreme Court finally ruled on a Tuesday night in December, as it turns out, the moderate Republicans, there were 5 of us at the time, Olympia Snowe and Susan Collins from Maine, Arlen Inspector from Pennsylvania, Jim Jeffords was still a Republican from Vermont, myself. And every Wednesday, Republicans would gather for lunch, us moderate Republicans would have lunch together. As it turns out, Arlen Inspector had invited Richard Cheney to join us at this December lunch. And when I saw the news the Supreme Court had ruled in the evening of that Tuesday, I thought, well, new Vice President-elect will never join us. He'll be too busy. So I went into the Wednesday lunch at Arlen Inspector's office, and there were all these cameras with booms, and I'd never seen such a massive media. And sure enough, there was the new Vice President-elect joining us for lunch, the 5 moderates. And don't forget, it was a 50-50 Senate. Those races had already been decided. It was a 50-50 Senate. Now here comes the tie-breaking vote, the new Vice President in the Senate in favor of the Republicans, joining us 5 moderates. And we did a little small talk at the lunch, and then the Vice President started talking about the agenda. And he said, we're going to have a huge tax cut. We're coming in with a $1.6 trillion tax cut right off the bat. That's going to be our signature initiative. We don't care about Kyoto. We don't care about the United Nations. We don't care about the International Criminal Court, all these international agreements. He's telling us, 5 moderates. And there's a cliche. I almost fell off my chair. But it was true at that lunch. I almost fell off my chair because I'm thinking to myself, this isn't what you campaigned on. This isn't what you campaigned on. And I'm also thinking, you're only the vice president. Where do you get off saying that everything we campaigned on is going to be 180 degrees different? And the other reason I almost fell off my chair is I didn't hear my fellow moderates pushing back. I expected Arlen Inspector and Susan Collins and Olympia Snowe, had been there much longer than I have, and Jim Jeffords, to say, with all due respect, Mr. Vice President, you're not going to get that. We're a block of 5, and in a 50-50 Senate, in a very, very divided partisan atmosphere, us 5 votes are going to be very significant, and we're not going to allow what you just said to occur. I didn't hear that happening from my colleagues. And so I was very alarmed, and I immediately wrote a letter when I got out of there. It's one of the most dispiriting days of my time in the Senate, that lunch when, number one, the Vice President saying we're going to be divisive, we're going to be arrogant, and my fellow moderates weren't pushing back. And the opposite was happening. They're kind of agreeing with him. I couldn't believe it. And nonetheless, off they went. The president, the first thing he did when he took the oath of office in January of 2001, took the oath of office. His very first act was an abortion, weighed into the most divisive issue in America. Very symbolic. His very first act was to repeal a Clinton abortion ruling, Mexico City Court or whatever it was. And then it was on to the big tax cut. Very, very divisive. Big, big battle. All that spring over this $1.6 trillion tax cut. And to put it in perspective, in October, President Clinton had vetoed a Republican-passed bill, as I said, I think it was the estate tax, that was $400 billion. And Clinton had vetoed it and said it's irresponsible, threatens the surplus, it's too deep. $400 billion. That's in October. Here we are in January talking about a $1.6 trillion tax cut. And whatever you might say about President Clinton, he did preside over the surplus, historic surpluses in my lifetime, after the Great Society in the 60s and the Vietnam War, and then to the malaise of the 70s, and then Reagan with his tax cuts that didn't work out in the 80s, and all the efforts to address the deficit, Graham Rudman and Ross Perot with his charts and everything, the deficit was the big issue. And the first President Bush even had to go back on his famous pledge, read my lips, no new taxes. It might have cost him re-election in '92 because of the deficits. And then President Clinton in '90, when he came in, won in '92, had to put in an economic package that might have cost him, he had a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, might have cost them both, that economic package in the elections of '94, as we all remember, all because of the deficits. And here was the president presiding over the historic surplus for the first time in my memory, saying that $400 billion is too deep and irresponsible. And yet, we're now debating 1.6. The 0.6 is bigger than the $400 billion that President Clinton had vetoed. And at first, many of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats, were saying, no, this is too deep or too big for the 1.6. But one by one, especially the Republicans, of course, were picked off. And either the president took them down to the White House, or Vice President Cheney, grabbed them by the lapels, or whatever happened. One by one, Chuck Grassley, who was chairman of the Finance Committee, at first he was saying, no, we're not going to do this. It's better to do it incrementally. Denny Hastert in the House was saying the same thing. But everybody fell in line to an administration that had come in on a 5-4 vote in the Supreme Court, losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College by 1 vote in a Supreme Court decision. And it was a huge battle that spring, resulting finally in Jim Jeffords leaving the party, if you remember, in the spring of 2001. And when he left fighting with the president over different initiatives, finally he just said he'd had enough. The first senator in American history to give the control of the Senate to the other side by walking across the aisle. Of course, other senators have walked across the aisle, but he's the first senator to change the makeup of the majority. And we finally voted on our budget on a Memorial Day. And that's usually we get the budget done in March or April. But this huge fight went on until Memorial Day. And we had our vote on a Saturday of Memorial Day weekend, as it turned out. And I went over, Jeffords had said to the president, I'm going to vote for it. I'm leaving the party, but I'll vote for your tax cut. And so I trudged over to vote on that Saturday morning thinking I'm going to be the only Republican. Going through my mind was every politician, whether a councilman or a state senator, or wants to vote for tax cuts. I mean, that's the most popular thing any politician can do, vote for tax cuts. And I was thinking, am I doing the right thing? Yes, we have surplus. Maybe we can afford this big tax cut. I don't want to be on the wrong side of it. But I'm thinking, no, I'm an old conservative, the old style Republican. If we can cut our spending, I'll cut taxes. But let's do this carefully. And so I went and voted no, and I came back and I thought, I'm going to be the only Republican. And when I got back to my office, my staff said, John McCain voted no. And he came from out of nowhere. We'd had amendments trying to scale it back. He was never on any of the amendments. He was never part of the discussion on possibly voting against this tax cut. So it's the John McCain we're seeing in this campaign, very impulsive, out of nowhere, erratic, or whatever the word is. But I was happy. I was happy to have company, especially John McCain. So I go back to Rhode Island and face my angry Republicans. I could say, John McCain voted no. So I was very happy, but kind of indicative of what we'd see from Senator McCain in the future. And then that summer we were spent rearranging the committees, Republicans laying off staff because now they're in the minority, Democrats hiring. And we came back from our August recess on a gorgeous, gorgeous day in September, and all of a sudden slamming into the towers, the Twin Towers, and down they came into the Pentagon, down the street from us, and the plane crashed. That gorgeous day, of course, turned terrible. And as I saw the Twin Towers come down, I had a sinking feeling in my stomach about our leadership, our president and vice president. Having seen them go back on their campaign pledges, I'm a uniter, not a divider, and then come in with this very, very divisive agenda, driving longtime Republican Jim Jeffords out of the party, and the arrogant approach to the world, going back on their bedrock campaign promises, I had this sinking feeling. And the towers are coming down. How are they going to lead us now in this moment of crisis, in this moment of great anger, in this moment of great fear, two powerful emotions, fear and anger? And I had my doubts. But nonetheless, September 11th was on a Tuesday. We met on a Thursday to give the president authorization to respond. And as always in Washington, the Republicans met in one room, the Democrats in another. And we were given a piece of paper, and I have it here, a copy of it, or maybe this is the original, one sheet of paper, and it's draft at the top. This is what we were given. And it's a resolution, whereas, therefore we give the president authorization to respond. And maybe you can see from back there, the first whereas says, whereas on September 11, 2001, acts of treacherous violence were committed against the United States and its citizens, and crossed off as treacherous, and written above it, handwritten above it, is despicable. And I'm looking in my seat at this one sheet of paper, And I'm thinking, well, yes, it's not treacherous, because treacherous comes from within, technically. So they're right to change that and choose despicable if they will. But can't they go to the computer and delete treacherous, type in despicable, get rid of the drafts at the top, and print out 100 clean copies before we go to war? Nonetheless, when we filed to vote, and I said to Gordon Smith from Oregon, this is going too fast. We haven't had any debate. And he said, Link, the train's left the station. So we filed in to vote. There were 2 votes. One was to give emergency money for New York City, and the other was, I think, $20 billion emergency money for New York City, and the other was this war authorization vote. And so they're calling the roll, and I'm Chafee, C in the alphabet, so I come fairly early, Chafee of Rhode Island. And I just had my doubts about the president, the vice president. So I said, no. And the senator next to me said, Link, you just voted against the money for New York City. And the other senator says, no, we're voting on the war authorization. It's the money for New York City. No, it's the war authorization. And so I went down, you've seen in the C-SPAN, the well of the Senate, I went from my chair. I went down to the parliamentarians and asked, what are we voting on? And they were arguing. It's the money for New York City. No, it's the war authorization. And in their defense, everybody expected it to be 100-0, so they weren't paying attention. But I think that's where the president and vice president, that's the atmosphere they thrive in, the irrelevancy of Congress. They don't even know what they're voting on. Just get 100-0 on both, and we move on with our agenda. As it turns out, my staff watching back in my office saw me vote no on the monitors and set the Carl Lewis, whoever holds the 100-yard dash record, quarter-mile dash record from the office to the Senate chamber, grabbed me by the lapels and said, you cannot vote no. The American people are angry, and they want to respond in some way. And I listened to my staff. I trust them. They said, back at the office, my chief of staff is having cardiac paddles put on his chest. Such was the atmosphere, of course. We all remember the Twin Towers coming down and everything. So I changed my vote before the roll was finished. I voted aye, and it was 100-0 on both. As it turns out, out of 535 members of Congress, 435 House members, 100 senators, only one voted no on this first authorization. This was Afghanistan, and that was Barbara Lee, African-American woman from Oakland, California. And she had death threats. She was hung in effigy. She had to have Capitol Police protection. And when I saw that, I'm thinking, I almost voted no. I'm going, whew, that could have been me. Such was the climate, though, that when I saw she voted no, I wrote out a little note to her and said, Dear Barbara, you go girl, or something. And then I thought better of sending it. I said, suppose and Barbara Lee says, see, Chafee supported me. Such was the climate. Don't speak up, or you're just going to get crushed and called unpatriotic. The Dixie Chicks, remember them? Had made some comment, and woof, the viciousness descended. That it wasn't long before the president and vice president were talking about Saddam Hussein in Iraq. The things went fairly well in Afghanistan. And all of a sudden, we're talking about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And just like the tax cut, so many of my colleagues were saying, this doesn't make any sense. There's no connection, Sunnis and al-Qaeda, this makes no sense. And one by one, just like the tax cut, I don't know whether they get a ride on Air Force One or down to the Oval Office or beaten up behind the woodshed, but one by one, everybody started falling into line to this preposterous premise that Saddam Hussein was a threat to the United States of America. And when that roll was called, there were 2 votes also. And the first one in October of 2002, the first one was an amendment offered by the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Carl Levin from Michigan, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. That's the most important committee dealing with military matters. And his amendment said, let's just slow this down. Excuse me, I've got a little bit of a cold. Let's just slow this down. Let's let the UN Security Council do their work. Let's let the inspectors, remember Hans Blix and the weapons inspectors? Finish their job over there. Let's let Tom Blix and weapons inspectors finish their job. Let's slow this down. Let the UN Security Council act on it. That was the Levin Amendment. And he also put in it, we'll meet within 24 hours as a Congress if any new information comes in. No matter where we are in the world, we'll meet within 24 hours to address any new information that might come up. So he had all his bases covered. And so that day, the roll in October of 2002, the roll was called on Levin. It was 76-24 no in the Senate. And then to war, 77-23, just one vote difference. No to Levin, aye to war, bang, bang, bang. And it was just shocking that the Founding Fathers set up the Congress, especially the Senate with our 6-year terms, to check a rogue executive. That they clearly foresaw that at some point in American history there would be a rogue executive. And Congress was set up to counter that, checks and balances. And especially the Senate, 2/3 of us are not up in any given time. And in this case, the elections were being held, midterm elections were being held in just weeks. But there were heroes. Robert C. Byrd, I can remember him yelling out, "Fie on this Congress! Fie on this Congress!" in exasperation. And Paul Wellstone was in a close race back home. He almost tied with his opponent back home in Minnesota. And he voted no. He had the guts to say no and then face his voters back home and explain why. And sadly, he died in a plane crash right before his election. So there were some heroes standing up. The curious thing about when you see the votes, 77-23 on the Iraq War resolution, so many Democrats, especially all the Republicans except me, went along, just shockingly. Senators, Republicans that have worked for years on international alliances, for some reason went along with this. But for Democrats, any Democrat that seemed to have ambition was falling in line, whether it's Senator Clinton or whether it was Senator Daschle or Senator Kerry or Senator Edwards, Senator Dodd. People that had ambition were all voting for it. And that was the leadership. That was the leadership of the Democratic Party. Those no votes are Paul Sarbanes, someone who's finishing his last term, or Ted Kennedy, Senator Kennedy, Senator Byrd. People might say the day has come and gone, or obscure senators like Senator Bingaman from New Mexico, who doesn't really have any great ambition. He just likes being a senator. So that was curious that was happening, that those people that had ambition seemed to be putting their own political advantage in front of what was right, what was so clearly preposterous that Saddam Hussein could be a threat to the United States of America. So nonetheless, it passed, and Senator Wellstone died in the plane crash, as I said, and then the Republicans won back the majority in that midterm 2002 election. So that was a crazy 2-year period. In just 2 years, we had the big tax cut, Jeffords leaving the party, Democrats taking control, September 11th happening, Afghanistan, vote to go to Afghanistan, then to Iraq, Paul Wellstone dying. It was a wild, wild 2 years. Republicans winning back the majority in 2002. Absolutely wild. And one of those critical elections was for the Republicans to win back the majority was in Georgia, where Senator Max Cleland, who had lost 2 legs and an arm in Vietnam, was called unpatriotic because he had voted. We were negotiating the new Homeland Security labor regulations. I was involved in those negotiations, and because we were holding up the Homeland Security bill as we tried to resolve some of these labor issues in the new Homeland Security Department. Of course, the Republicans didn't want any kind of unions, so they were playing hardball. And some of us were trying to negotiate, and Max Cleland was one of those. And so he was branded as unpatriotic, and he lost. It was a critical loss for the Democrats. But curiously now, that same Senate seat 6 years later is up. And I think a lot of people, they say that Senator Chambliss, who won in 2002, is in trouble. And a lot of people are remembering what happened to Max Cleland and saying that wasn't fair, calling that man who had lost 2 legs and an arm. He had one arm in a wheelchair, had to dress himself with one arm. There was a story about how he did it, and no legs. And they dared call him unpatriotic. So it's circling around, and we'll see what happens in a couple of days, I guess, down in Georgia. But they say it's a very close race. And so that brought us into the presidential re-election cycle, as we call it. And right away, you could see the strategy for Bush-Cheney, and that is energize the base, motivate the base. And that's the Karl Rove strategy. Divide America, but energize our base. And that's what they did. More tax cuts for the corporations and the wealthy. More drilling, more votes to drill in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. More abortion votes. All these motivate the base votes. At the same time, the Democrats didn't seem to capture the same strategy. At first, they seemed to with Governor Dean from Vermont. He kind of rallied the anti-war. People were angry. There were no weapons of mass destruction. And the war was not going well at that point. We had Abu Ghraib, and we had the bridge in Fallujah where the American servicemen were burned, and all the Iraqis were cheering around it. Those images of cheering Iraqis as our servicemen hung from the bridge in Fallujah. And so things weren't going well in Iraq. And at first, the Democratic Party seemed to go with Dean, but then they probably thought, we can't go with a small state governor. We need somebody with a little more gravitas. So Kerry won the nomination. He quickly picked Edwards, Senator Edwards, who had also voted for the war. So it didn't seem as though the Democrats were doing the same thing, energizing their base. And when the swift vote, Veterans for Truth, or whatever that group was pillaring Senator Kerry, what did he do? He went windsurfing in Nantucket. Images of him windsurfing in Nantucket, and while he's getting beaten up. And I remember, as one who had announced to the press that I would not be voting for Bush Cheney, even as a Republican, I said I'd keep my Republican credentials intact by writing in a Republican, but I wasn't going to vote for him. When I heard the question to Senator Kerry in August before the November election, if you knew then what you knew now, would you still vote for the war? And he said yes. And he said, after everything had been proven false, he said yes. And you could just hear the air going out of the Democratic base. And nonetheless, it was close. It was close in November of '04. I was in my basement watching the results come in. My family had gone to sleep. We have a TV down in the basement. And I'm watching the wee hours of the morning. Finally, Ohio comes in. A long wait for Ohio. Finally, it comes in for Bush Cheney. And the screen lights up, new president-elect. And I'm thinking, well, this isn't so good for the country. But I'm also thinking, this isn't good for me personally. As I sat watching in the wee hours of November of '04, I'm thinking, I'm going to be up in 2006, and they're not going to be on the ballot. I am. And they're not going to change. I know them well enough. They're not going to change. And so what are my options? What are my options? What do I do? Do I run as an independent? Well, the first thing they're going to ask, well, who are you going to caucus with? So if I say I'm going to caucus with the Democrats, why don't you just run as a Democrat? Here I am, a lifelong Republican. And that's a big step to take. Jeffords just went independent and caucus, but I'm thinking if I run as a Republican, certainly with the Republicans winning the White House and also winning bigger majorities in the Senate and holding on to the House, we're going to be in control. It doesn't make sense to leave the majority when I look after my state. And I'm thinking maybe I don't run at all. These things are all going through my mind. I also knew there were two big bills coming up, very, very important bills. The highway bill, which comes up every 6 years, and that is it takes the gas tax, highway trust fund. The gas tax goes into a highway trust fund. When you fill up your car with gas, you pay a federal gas tax, of course. That goes into a highway trust fund, and every 6 years it gets distributed. Hundreds of billions of dollars gets distributed to the states around the country. And I'm on the Environment and Public Works Committee, the right committee, and I'm in the majority party. Very, very important to look after Rhode Island on the highway bill. And coming up in this cycle was something called base realignment and closure. And if you're a member of Congress, if you want to scare a member of Congress, say base realignment and closure. No congressman or senator wants to be realigned or closed in their state. And that comes up every 10 years. And here it is coming up in this cycle. So I was thinking about that in my basement. All these thoughts are going through my mind. And the next day, my brother comes over, my younger brother, and we're walking around the yard, and I describe to him what I just described to you, and I say, what do you think? He said, you're screwed. And it's still going through my mind. I don't want to be screwed. What do I do? Well, I like honesty. So I go back. We had a lame duck section in Washington. We go back, and the phone rings right after the election. And it's Mitch McConnell, our Republican whip from Kentucky, on the line. And he said, Link, I know what you must be thinking. I couldn't believe it. He was reading my mind. Link, I know what you must be thinking. We want you to stay a Republican. We're going to help you on the highway bill. We're going to help you on BRAC. We'll help you in your re-election campaign in '06. We like your voice in the caucus. You're saying all the right things. I hope you stay a Republican. And I didn't get any call from a Democrat. No Democrat was calling. Link, I know what you must be thinking. If you want to become a Democrat, we'll protect you. We won't let a bill pass that has any retribution for Rhode Island on highway or BRAC. I didn't get that call, and that symbolizes the two parties. The Republicans focused. I was so surprised. I thought they'd be popping champagne, celebrating, and we don't have to worry about that pest Chafee, let him do whatever he wants. No, they're looking after every seat. Focused Republicans, whereas the Democrats in disarray. It reminded me of Will Rogers' quote, "I'm not the member of any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." And that was back in the 30s. I think he died in the 30s, so things haven't changed in 80 years, in 70 years. And so I decided to stay a Republican, and sure enough, what's the administration do? The first thing, privatize Social Security. That was the first big initiative of the new re-elected administration. And for Rhode Island, a high elderly state, it's just the worst thing you could do for a Republican. And then it was John Bolton to the United Nations, the most undiplomatic man to be our top diplomat. And then it was then it was the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor, retired, that critical vote, 5-4 vote, Ronald Reagan appointee, but carefully navigating complex issues. Great voice in the Supreme Court, from my opinion. She retires, so of course, you know what's coming out of this administration. So we had those votes, and I had a primary. I knew I had a primary from the right wing, and so I can't win on any of these votes. I alienate my primary voters, or I alienate my general election voters. So I just tried to do the right thing. Voted against Bolton. I voted for him the first time. When it came back the second time, I voted against him, and voted against Alito for Sandra Day O'Connor's seat. That was the only Republican to vote against Sam Alito, Justice Alito. And, of course, Social Security went away anyway. But all these issues, I was just saying I'm going to do the right thing and take my chances in the primary. And right before we went for our to go out to the fall campaign of 2006, the Republicans teed up 3 issues. And as in the majority, you get to set the agenda. So in June and July, before our August recess and before the fall campaign of 2006, the 3 issues the Republicans teed up was first a federal crime on abortion, something about crossing state lines. We had 3 weeks of debate, and then we vote on that. And then it was on to a constitutional amendment, amend our sacred Constitution to forbid states from enacting their own gay marriage laws. We're going to amend the Constitution to forbid Vermont or Massachusetts or Oregon from enacting their own gay. This is the Republican Party, the States' Rights Party. That failed, and then it was on to another constitutional amendment. 3 weeks of debates and back and forth and then voting, and it's on to another constitutional amendment, and that was flag burning. Amend our Constitution to take away our First Amendment freedom of speech rights on flag burning. And it was so hypocritical that the Republicans were talking about spreading freedom around the world while we're reining it in at home. That's what makes us great. That's what makes America great. We have these great rights, especially freedom of speech. And here we were going to have a constitutional amendment. And the veterans groups, American Legion, VFW, all coming to see me, and they were saying, Link, if you don't vote for this, our members are going to come out in your primary and vote against you. And in Rhode Island, a Republican primary is a very small universe. And so each of these groups, they knew they had leverage. And I explained to them, I said, when was the last time you saw somebody burn the flag? This is just a political issue to try and get the Democrats to vote against it. Nobody's burning the flag. And it's hypocritical to talk about freedom around the world. And finally, per the Constitution, if we pass it, then it goes to the 50 state legislatures. If it passes the Congress with the required percentage, 2/3, it goes to 50 state legislatures. And we're going to poison 50 state legislatures in Albany and around the country, and Lansing, or all the capitals around the world. All of a sudden they're going to be fighting over this non-issue, tearing apart every legislature, 50 state legislatures. So I went in and voted no, and it was a very close vote. The House had passed it. The President promised to sign it. And as it turned out, it failed by 1 vote. Failed by one vote. Proudest vote I ever cast. Going in there going, you can bring out your VFW, you can bring out your American Legion. Freedom of speech is more important than my future in any primary. And curiously, there were 3 Republicans to vote no on the flag-burning amendment. Chafee from Rhode Island, and McConnell from Kentucky, and Bennett from Utah. How's that? 2 of the most conservative Republicans, Bennett from Utah, McConnell from Kentucky, and Chafee the most liberal. So I like to say the lines of liberalism and conservatism crossed on this issue, freedom of speech. And failed by 1 vote. So great credit goes to Bennett and McConnell for that. Oh, if we'd sent it to 50 state legislatures, this non-issue, what a tragedy and shame. And I don't want to pick on any particular senators, but it did amuse me that the 2 senators from New Hampshire voted aye, voted for the amendment. And what's on their license plates? Live free and die. You got to take that off your license plates if you're going to vote. I like them both, but that did amuse me. And as it turned out, those issues didn't work. I did win my primary, but those 3 issues that, just like in 2000 when Trent Lott said, oh, we're fighting these issues because they help us in the elections, it didn't work in November of 06. Out went Chafee in Rhode Island, out went DeWine in Ohio. These are incumbent Republicans. Out went Santorum in Pennsylvania, Allen in Virginia, Burns in Montana, Talent in Missouri. Big wipeout for Republicans, losing the majority. And I clearly foresaw in my basement what I was up against way back in 04. And my opponent, all he talked about, 6 seats, 6 seats. We need 6 seats to check this administration. And Rhode Islanders listened and acted. And I wasn't surprised. I knew from, as I said, way back in November. And so I gave long thought after losing as to the future of the Republican Party. Do I stay a Republican? And I just didn't think things were going to change. For instance, after losing, we had a lame duck session. That's no fun, by the way. Going back to finish up your work after having your membership revoked. But nonetheless, and also as a part of our lame duck session, we elected new leaders for the new Congress. And in the Senate, Lamar Alexander was running to be our whip. And he'd worked hard to get the votes, even meeting with every Republican senator, and he thought he had it won. And despite the carnage of the November election, when I couldn't vote in this because it was for the next Congress, but Lamar lost by 1 vote to Trent Lott for this leadership position as a Republican leaders. And I said, they don't get it, that nothing's going to change. I mean, Lamar's not liberal by any means, but he's not just lockstep conservative either. He's a thoughtful person. That's just 1 voice in our 5-member leadership in the Senate. And we're not going to have 1 different voice after the wipeout that we just suffered at the polls, losing the majority. No, Trent Lott, the same going on. So that was on my mind. And finally, about 6 months after the election, I went down to my board of canvassers and became an independent. It's funny, the woman behind the counter said, you can't do that. You're a Republican. Chafee's been Republican the whole time. You can't do that. Don't you want to go out and think about it? She was giving me such a hard time that I did go out to my car and I said, no, I've thought about this for 6 months. I'm becoming an independent. And as such, I could vote in the presidential primaries coming up in Rhode Island. Independent voters can choose Democrat primary or Republican. I'm watching all the candidates running. And many of my colleagues, Brownback and Clinton and Thompson and Biden and Dodd, I served with them, and Senator Obama. And I had my reservations about Senator Obama in the beginning. Is he ready for this? Is he ready for this? I served on 2 committees with him, Foreign Relations, Environment, and Public Works. So I knew him only overlapped for 2 years. But I liked his message, a message of international cooperation, particularly healing some of the damage we've done to our reputation around the world. And I liked his message, the fierce urgency of now. Remember that? The fierce urgency of now. I like that. Of course, a gorgeous speaker. And particularly what I liked also was that his campaign was the best run campaign. That even Clinton, with all her experience, and McCain with having run in 2000, they had management shakeups and firing people and cost overruns. The Obama campaign was very frugal, no cost overruns, no management shakeups, an organization of something I've never seen, such quality. They like each other, they trust each other, and he's the CEO. He chose these people to run this underdog campaign from the beginning. And so I called him up and said, I'm going to support you in the Democratic primary in Rhode Island. And he said, great, can you help me go around to some events? I said, of course. And so the campaign in Rhode Island, there were lots of primaries going on, but they sent me to a senior center in my hometown of Warwick, among other events to go to. And at the senior event, in the question and answer, a woman raised her hand and said, can we really vote for somebody named Barack Hussein Obama? And well, don't judge a book by its cover. Listen to his message and where the direction he wants to take the country. And maybe you voted for Franklin Delano Roosevelt. That was an odd name. It turned out all right. And curiously, a few days later, I tried to convince him. Then a few days later, at the Watson Institute for International Studies, we hosted a conference for South Americans, and a 2-day conference. And at the end of it, we started talking about our election. And the most animated discussion among these South Americans after 2 days of talking about other issues was on our election. Animated and discussion about what's happening here in America. And a woman from Ecuador, jumped up to her feet and said, the best thing America could do is elect someone named Barack Hussein Obama. So I think that's where we are in a few days. A lot of insecurities voiced by that woman in Warwick. Are a lot of insecurities, or the world saying, please tell us the last 8 years isn't the real America. I think that's what we're going to decide in a couple of days. So thank you very much.
I'd like to thank you. That was just so fascinating, and I'm sure we want to open this to questions. And if you can just wait till the mic comes. Is that right? We wait till the mic comes and then ask a question. Don't give a speech. Okay? All right. Go ahead.
It seems that Congress is still gutless, self-serving, and incompetent with respect to the fiscal crisis. They're throwing hundreds of billions of dollars at the banks and the Wall Street without solving the problem. In fact, creating a problem which will be stagflation. If subprime is still the problem, underlying problem, why don't they simply have a moratorium for 3 to 5 years on foreclosures, bring back the APR rate to the original, and phase in the reserve requirement increase and the mark-to-market increase over 5 years, which would solve the liquidity problem. Could you address that?
How do you refer to Congress? What were your adjectives?
Well, they were
gutless, self-serving, and incompetent. Well, that's the subject of my book. What happened? How come Congress didn't do our jobs? Obviously, rogue executives are going to come along, as I said. And I don't have a good answer. I pondered it and pondered it. Why gutless and incompetent? At critical moments in our history, don't forget what this administration inherited. They inherited surplus, and they inherited a peaceful world, a relatively peaceful world. Silvio Berlusconi gave us a talk to the joint session of Congress, and in it, he talked about hosting the G8 summit in Genoa, Italy, in March of 2001. And I'm sitting in my chair at the joint session listening to his speech, and he said, and this is the beginning months of the Bush administration, at the G8 summit, I looked out at the end of the meeting. We had a dinner, and I looked out, and I saw Kazumi of Japan talking with Blair of England. I saw Putin of Russia talking with Schroeder of Germany. I saw Bush in there, and they're all laughing and joking. What a peaceful world we're handing to our children. An age of lasting peace beckoned. And I'm thinking that's exactly right. Peaceful world we're handing to our children. That's what Bush Cheney inherited. And why didn't Congress stand up and protect our surplus and protect that peaceful world? I don't have a good answer. And I lost my election because the American people and Rhode Islanders and across the other states I mentioned, all across America with Montana, Virginia, Pennsylvania, were saying, please check this administration. It hasn't happened.
Well, what about the fiscal crisis?
The fiscal crisis is absolutely along the same lines. That huge tax cut, $1.6 trillion, started it. That was when discipline broke. There's no more discipline anymore. Spend, spend, spend. Then we went on to the Farm Bill, just adding back subsidies that we gotten off of. We added a Homeland Security Department, whole new bureaucracy, kaplunk. We put a prescription drug benefit on Medicare, hundreds of billions of dollars on a program that's difficult to fund as it is, Medicare. I voted against Medicare prescription drug benefit, but not enough of my colleagues did. And the best answer I can give is, as I ponder, why doesn't Congress stand up and show some guts at these critical times, is that, and I don't know if I'm right on this, but you hear the Senate in particular is the most exclusive club in the world. And to have your membership taken from this exclusive club, I think for many of my colleagues was the worst thing that could ever happen. And I just think that's the wrong attitude to have. There's lots of fun things you can do outside of being a senator. But I think that's an attitude that has gotten us in some of these pickles.
Mr. Senator, good evening.
Yes, that was a long answer.
One day before the 2004 elections, John Kerry was ahead by 4 points in the national polls. He lost the elections. The latest CNN poll of polls that came out this evening showed John McCain trailing Obama only by 4.5 points. They cut Obama's lead in half in just a week. The Fox News poll that came out early today showed Obama leading by only 2%. In your assessment, what are the chances of McCain winning on Tuesday? And do you think, given the balance of power between the executive branch and Congress, it would actually be a good thing to have a Republican in charge of the White House and Democrats in charge of Congress?
No, I think Senator Obama's right. We need radical change. Fierce urgency of now. We cannot wait. We cannot have another 4 years, especially internationally. I mean, Senator McCain and I shared some votes, a tax cut vote against drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. He was good on that. He formed the Gang of 14, or helped form it, that addressed the Supreme Court justices. But he's always wrong on our international relations. He always had that belligerent approach to the world, and I don't think we can afford that. He absolutely cannot afford that in this age of nuclear weapons. And we need to get back to what Prime Minister Berlusconi described, where people who can get into a room, former adversaries, and have some leadership and guide not only our country, but our planet in the right direction. I myself believe that on Tuesday, Senator Obama is going to have a big win. What I've seen from the young people, in fact, I was just at my post office mailing a letter, and behind the counter they were saying, we've never seen absentee ballots. And these were 2 longtime employees. We've never seen absentee ballots like this. We're just overwhelmed with students coming in, sending home their absentee ballots. And I've gone to Michigan, I've gone to Ohio, I've gone to Florida for Senator Obama, and the organization, the masses of people that are out there in tiny towns across Michigan. There's an Obama headquarters because they have so many volunteers.
That's right.
And they're not all young either. Mm-hmm. They're of every age. So I think it's going to be a big win. I just don't see any momentum for Senator McCain. It's a lot of Republicans that were going to stick it out with Senator McCain, but when he picked Governor Palin, that was it. I know a lot of people that were going to stick it out with him, but that pushed them into the other column, into the Obama column, that pick for vice president. So that's the way I feel.
Mr. Chafee, excuse me, I'm here. It's very encouraging to hear a man of principle. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, but they Republicans, or a lot of them, are attacking Barack because of his middle name, Hussein. Well, one need not necessarily connect Hussein with Saddam Hussein. Why not connect him with King Hussein, who is indeed a man of principle and a wonderful person and highly respected, not only in the Middle East, but all over the world. So why not think of Barack, King Hussein?
Yes, I don't think the Obama campaign wants to fight on that issue. But good point. They're doing so many things right. As I said, I've never been so impressed. There's no swift boat momentum that gets going. Everything that comes up in the debate, the last debate when Senator McCain said, if you wanted to run against George Bush, you should have run 4 years ago. It's a great line. But the next day, there was an ad. The next day, there was an ad addressing that. They were on it. They were on it in milliseconds. And, for instance, I got a call from the Obama campaign. Joe Lieberman's going to be in New Hampshire, giving a press conference for McCain. Can you get up there and balance it off? And so I did. Jumped in my car and drove to Concord, and I was able to do that, cancel some things. But the Obama campaign was on it. Everything. We're going to fight like a back alley fight for this.
I just want to preface, as an independent, as the one time in my life I voted a straight party ticket was in 2006. I hope it's the last time, because I thought any Republican, good or bad, is an enabler of the president. So, but my question is then, have you thought about any changes in the governance of the Senate with the caucuses and the committee system and the power of committee chairs, so that this sort of problem might be ameliorated in the future?
I don't think it's the system. I think it's the people. And some good people, but they didn't show the wisdom and spine. With our gutless, incompetent, and what was the other one? That's what my words. What was the middle one?
Well, myopic.
Okay. Never mind. Yes.
Thank you for your remarks tonight and for your courage. Voices like yours, moderation in the Republican Party, are sorely needed. So as I listened to Sarah Palin saying that if they lose, or I suppose even if they win, she's going to be a big player in the Republican Party, which sends chills up my spine. So do you have a scenario, even though you're an independent, about how the Republican Party could be restructured to come back to a more moderate tradition, the tradition of the Barbara Conobles and Bob Michael and people of that sort?
I thought about that for those 6 months after the election and before going down to the Board of Canvassers, and I just didn't think the pendulum was going to swing back. I thought long and hard, because I figured once I left the party I couldn't go back to it. And I think the leaders, we saw that with the vote with Trent Lott beating Lamar Alexander, and that, might say insignificant leadership thing, but they're just stuck in their ramparts. And the fact that Senator McCain could not choose who he wanted for vice president, they promised a floor fight. If you didn't pick, we'll fight your pick in the floor of the convention. Senator McCain didn't want that. A bitter fight that he might lose over his own pick for vice president, that rabid base, that vicious base of the Republican Party, threatening their nominee with a floor fight. And those are the people that run the party. And I felt very vindicated that I left the party when I saw him choose Governor Palin. So that's the party of the Republican Party of the future. I don't want anything to do with it.
Now, once again, from the McCain campaign, we're hearing them preach that it's better to have our federal government divided than to have one party control the executive and both branches of Congress. I'd like your opinion about that.
I'm willing to give Senator Obama a chance with a Democratic Senate. It looks like it's going to happen, a Democratic House. And I think he's going to have to get some early successes. The Bill O'Reillys and the Sarah Palins and the Rush Limbaughs, they're not going away. And so I do think Senator Obama's got to have some quick successes, get some low-hanging fruit. Not like poor President Clinton that had health care go south on him. Get some early success, maybe on energy, something to do with energy, and get some momentum. So I'm willing to give him a Democratic House, Democratic Senate, Democratic President, even with veto-proof or filibuster-proof numbers in the Senate, 60. We need to move this country forward. The trouble with the Rove strategy, and Governor Palin is a perfect example of this, energize the base, motivate the base. It's great for winning elections, sometimes, but it's terrible for governing, because you divide the country. You motivate the base and you divide the country, and then you can't govern. And so I think we need a whole new, and that's what Senator Obama promised right from his first speech to the 2004 Democratic Convention, before he was even elected to the Senate. We need to bring America together. and move us forward to our potential. So, well, I'm an enthusiastic supporter.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming. Had I been a resident of Rhode Island, I would have leaped across party lines to vote for you. So I appreciate it. I have a question, and there was mention in the introduction about a third way. And last summer, I believe there was a meeting of moderates from both the Republicans and the Democrats exploring another way, since the two-party system has become dysfunctional to a large degree. And I was wondering if you could expand on that, if you were familiar with that development.
Yes. My last chapter in my book is about that third party, as Susan said. And when I submitted the manuscript to the publisher, it was September of a year ago. And at that time, it looked like Senator Clinton was going to be the nominee, and then whoever the Republicans nominated. And I just thought another polarized election. There's the potential for somebody to drive up the middle. And yes, Mayor Bloomberg was certainly thinking about that possibility. It wasn't just me. Others were thinking. There was a group called Unity 08, Democrats and Republicans. Maybe that's what you're referring to. And I did meet with them, getting Democrats and Republicans together to get a candidate and a vice presidential candidate and run it as a Unity 08, is what they were going to call it, candidacy, raise the millions you need to raise. But when Obama came along, he captured that desire for change and for something different. He got the young people energized, and Mayor Bloomberg, his thoughts of running a third-party candidacy seemed to go away, and everybody now seems to. Many former Republicans, Powell and others, are Bill Weld, and that might have been involved in third party, now saying Obama. Yes.
This gentleman here in the back.
Yeah, going to your point before why the Senate didn't change, I'm thinking back in time, Margaret Chase Smith crossed party lines during the McCarthy era. And these last, since 2001, we've passed a lot of legislation that have really eroded our civil liberties. What are the chances of getting them rolled back? And what about the possibility of presidents sneaking in administration as they're leaving office, passing a whole slew of legislation? What can we do to prevent this from happening again, like depressions and recessions?
Yes, once again, that is the subject of my book, that why didn't I was the only Republican until I was joined late by Senator McCain to vote against a tax cut. It would have been great in a 50-50 Senate right in the beginning to show the Bush-Cheney administration that there's going to be an equal partnership here with Congress and the executive branch. It just didn't happen. I'm at a loss to explain why. Well, I tried to understand why. And yes, there were years of partisanship, but we're in terrible straits right now, internationally and economically. Because of that failure. So I don't have a good answer, but I am optimistic, and I have great faith in the American voter. And this new generation coming along, it's great to see them involved in the political process. It's been a long time, maybe back to '72. The young people are all over the country, even high school people. I go speak at some high schools, and they can't vote, but they're following the primaries, they're following the debates, they're following the election. And that's great, I think, for the future of the country. Of course, if Obama doesn't win, they're going to be demoralized and disenchanted.
I have 2 points to make. One, my first job after getting out of the service in World War II, I was in a factory where the bathrooms were segregated, black and white, in the state of Maryland, not in the Deep South. And the black employees, it was an apparel company, and the black employees were generally more dexterous and better earners on a piece rate system than the whites. And it was extremely hard to make that change. I did it, but to make the change that they're equal people. And I wonder how much of that is going to carry into this potential election. That's question one. Question two is an economic one. I don't know if you ever heard of a Russian economist named Nikolai Kondratiev, who said that every 45 to 60 years there is a major depression. And from 1800 through the 30s, not just a recession, but from 1800 through the 30s, that happened every 45 to 60 years. And I keep asking this professor at MIT who's taught me about that, is this it? And he seems to think that this is a bigger downturn than we've had in a long time. How big, obviously, nobody knows. So could you address either one or both of those issues, the black issue and the...
Yes. The mayor I beat, I was a councilman in my city of Warwick, and I ran for mayor, and I lost the first time, and then I came back 2 years later and beat the fellow who beat me. And I ran into him recently, and at the time I was supporting Senator Obama going around to some events. His name was Charlie Donovan, and he was as Democrat as they come. His dad was a Democratic councilman. He was a Democratic, what they call a yellow dog Democrat. He'd vote for a yellow dog if it was a Democrat. And he said to me, Link, I can't support your man. He knew I was for Obama. And I said to myself, what? Charlie Donovan? I never voted for anybody but Democrats. And I was thinking, is it racial? Is this racial? And so, yes, I think that you can't ignore it. You can't ignore that it's an issue, just like you experienced in the factory. And we've come a long way in this country, but we still need to. Maybe Charlie Donovan's eventually going to vote for Senator Obama. I hope he does. But when I heard that, I certainly wondered what the issue was there. As far as the depression, I'm optimistic. I think we're going to get this. Some of the questions about the spend. Yeah, we have to get some discipline back in Washington and get some honesty into our culture again. It seemed to be that the Bush administration made dishonesty okay, and it filtered out into, I'm united, not a divider. No, you weren't. I'm going to have a humble foreign policy. No, you didn't. Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction. We don't warrantless wiretap. We don't torture. This culture of dishonesty seemed to seep into every fabric of America, because it was set from the top. Ends justify the means. We're going to change that and get back on our feet.
I think we'd like to say thank you very much.
A couple of things on addressing the problems. There's ways we're heading for depression. There's ways